Well, welcome to episode number 3 of the Two Perspectives Show. I'm Reverend Lee, and I'm joined by Dr. Niranjan. And today we are going to talk about the mind. And we chose this title because it's a very confusing title. There's so many definitions that people have about it, so we thought we'd spend some time and explore that with you. And we'll start off today with Niranjan giving us his perspective, and then I'll join in after he's done.
The question is, what is the mind? A fairly simple and straightforward question. But the answer may not be as straightforward. Anything we do to describe the mind or talk about the mind as a definition, that comes from the mind itself. So in other words, the mind is trying to define itself. It's like the eye which cannot see itself. So what is the mind? Well, you can think of the mind as a ball of energy that we wear around ourselves every day, every moment. In a sense, the mind is the aura we carry. Some people are fascinated with, oh, is my aura good or bad? But if you just spend some time and look within and analyze thought patterns and where your motivations and desires are, that's reflected as your energy around you, which is your aura. The mind itself can be thought of as a house. So the house has different components. It's got the inside, it's got the outside, it's got a roof, it's got windows, so on and so forth. When we say define your house, you can't really define your house, you can describe it. You can describe it in many different ways. When I think of the mind, I think of it in terms of its 16 aspects. So what are those 16 aspects of the mind? The power to recall, the power to project, the power to experience, the power to analyze, the power to store, the power to distract. It has a time element, it's got a space element. And whenever we feel the world around us through our different senses, there's a subtle correlate of those senses in the mind. When you have a visual experience as a thought, we see, but we don't see with our physical eyes, but we see with those subtle eyes. So those 5 aspects are correlates with the physical senses. And then finally, the mind has the ability to create an identity that I am this, I am that. Intellect is also another aspect of the mind.
That's interesting how you presented that, especially the idea of the house and the aspects of the mind. From my spiritual background and how I've studied, I see it a little differently, and I know that we can integrate it, but I look at it as this way. I know there's a universal intelligence that is the underlying governing principle of this cosmos, this universe, this world, whatever you want to call it. And I understand that that intelligence is everywhere present, always present, constantly expressing and experiencing itself. And what I know for myself is that I'm an individual point of consciousness within all of that consciousness. So my mind, if I want to use it as that, is a microcosm of the macrocosm. And so when I think about that there are really 2 aspects to the mind that I use. And the aspects of the mind that I use are both the conscious and the unconscious aspect. The conscious aspect represents maybe 5% of what I think. Everything else is in the unconscious, and it's basically habits of thinking, it's where all our memories are, it's those functions, it's the part of the mind that controls your heartbeat, controls your biological functions, the reproduction of cells, all things that you have no idea that are going on in any moment, but they're going on. And so as I understand it, the more aware we become means we are more conscious of how we're using this mind, which creates our life experience. And so if I'm conscious that I'm focusing my mind on being a spiritual teacher and bringing ideas to people that help them lift themselves to a greater level of awareness, the more I focus on that, I become that which I focus on. But what happens so often is we don't realize that we have the power to use our mind consciously, and we go into a loop. It's like the movie Groundhog Day, where we're recreating the same thing over and over and over again. So the idea is there are no words that can adequately describe the mind, just like Niranjan said. There are no words, but we can describe it. But here's the key thing. It's like electricity. You can't describe electricity, but if you turn the light switch on and the light goes on, you can use it. And if you can learn how to use your mind, you can create a whole new experience.
That's an interesting perspective. You mentioned that there are two aspects of the mind that you use. If we were to distill the mind into two aspects, this is how I would approach it. I've used the analogy of the house as the mind. The exterior paint of the house is our conscious mind, the thoughts that go through our mind. Imagine a house with a hodgepodge of paint of different color. It would look, may not fit in with the rest of the neighborhood, but that's how the house is. So we got to accept the mind for what it is. But no matter what the color of the paint on the outside, probably the more important part of the house is the roof. It keeps us safe from the elements. Keeps us insulated and warm in the winter and cool in the summer and so forth. These days, a lot of people have solar panels on the roof. So the roof serves an additional function, which is to absorb energy and into a form that's usable by us in the house to light up our refrigerators, televisions, computers, and so on. If you look at the mind and say, okay, the aspect that is outward facing towards the world, I'm going to keep it as if it's my roof, meaning I'm going to keep all the energies that I don't want to be part of away from me. That would be the protective aspect of the roof. But at the same time, I'm not going to block the world off. I'm also going to imbibe good energies. And Reverend Wolak mentioned about the universal energy and the individualized energy that the mind is. As part of the universal energy is the billions of people and their mental energies, which constantly intersect with one another. There's a lot of beneficial energies out there, a lot of good people that you would want to associate with. And you don't necessarily have to associate with them in person through a talk, but you can associate with them in thought. Thinking about a person attracts the energy of that person to us. It's not something that we can prove by scientific ways. I'll give you a common example. You have a very loving life partner, and you've gone on a business trip and you're thinking about him or her, and the moment you think about that person, that loving energy automatically fills your being. And how does that fill your being? It's coming through the power of thought. Let's say there's someone that you dislike and you think about that person, the whole internal being is filled with a more toxic type of feeling. We can be selective and pick the energies that we think would be beneficial for our growth. And as we grow, we in turn put those energies out and help other people grow. In a forest, one tree doesn't take over the forest. It doesn't say that I want all the sun, I want all the land, I want all the water, but it's a shared place. And through the sharing that happens in the symbiotic relationship with the animals, the insects, the birds, the whole place thrives. We can lift each other up, not just ourselves, lift each other up. It's a slow process, but it can be done if more people know the power of thought, the power of the mind. And perhaps in a future discussion, we can go more into how to calibrate the mind and how to make it more effective, and also talk about this element of awareness that Reverend Wolak touched on, which is the ability to perceive. We can use the mind as a beneficial tool and not as a source of pain or distraction and so forth. We talked about those 16 aspects. Let's take an example and go over how those 16 aspects of the mind come into play. Let's say you have a lottery ticket in your hand that happens to be the winning numbers of the Powerball. You won yourself $1 million, a life-changing amount for anybody. That is an experience that you likely are never going to forget. As soon as you have that experience, that instant that experience comes within you, you can't contain it. So what do? You project it. So you project a future, all the good things that can happen to you with that money. And then you recall all the suffering that you had, which is now left behind. And then you analyze this and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do with this. This is how I'm going to allocate it, and so on and so forth. And then this experience is a powerful experience that is stored in our subconscious mind. And we have the ability to recall this whenever we talk about it. Let's say you meet somebody else and then you mention the thrill and the joy that you had. That's a recall of that experience. And this experience, although thrilling and life-changing, is also a distraction, because it takes you away from who you really are, that observer, the awareness aspect, which we'll talk about in subsequent talks. And along with this experience, we talked about the 5 senses. So you feel all the senses become heightened when you have this thrilling, powerful experience with them. Your eyesight seems sharper, your ears seem perkier, your sense of touch is heightened, and then the world smells good. Anything you put in your mouth tastes good because you're having a good experience in the mind. And around this experience, you form a new identity. You leave the old one behind, the suffering old self is left behind, and the new self that is enjoying the world now enters. That's the ability to create this identity. And then what do you do with this experience and what has come your way? You use your intellect to say, okay, I'm going to do this or that. I'm not going to be foolish about this, and I'm going to be responsible. So that one experience covers the entire 16 aspects that we talked about earlier when it comes to the mind. The most fundamental aspect of the mind is the ability to experience. We experience the world through our mind. The mind is the most important thing as an interface between us and the world. So it's all the more important that we know, understand, and have the tools to make the best use of this wonderful gift that we can call the mind, our energy body that we wear around us at all times.
And what's really fascinating, if we take this forward, prior to that person winning the lottery, if they hadn't used the gift that the mind gives us, and that is our imagination, they wouldn't respond differently. See, the imagination is that aspect of the mind which allows us to go beyond our physical experiences of our senses and of our memories and to go beyond that. How I like to look at it is that all wisdom, infinite wisdom, is within the universal mind, within the macrocosm. And here we are as a point of consciousness, as the microcosm of that mind. And what our job is to have a greater experience of life is to open up to the macrocosm. And when we open up to the macrocosm, the ability to imagine things beyond our current experience starts to come into our mind. And then if it's in alignment with what we're desiring, the desire to express more life. See, I don't talk about, I'm not big into the desiring of a new car, a desiring of this material thing or that thing. I have a desire to experience more life. And the only way that I can have that experience is through my use of the mind. Now, I can consciously use the mind to have that experience, or I can unconsciously allow the experience to happen to me, which then makes me a victim. And what you're seeing most in the world right now is that most people are not living consciously. And by not living consciously, they're living by what I call the law of averages. They've not determined where they're going. So whatever the average energy around them is, will be the energy or the wisdom that guides them to their experience. But when we become conscious and we realize that that power is within us, we can direct that power to a greater experience of life. And this is what sets us apart from animals. And this is what sets us apart. And one of the things that that I've heard 1,000 times is people are using their minds, do not succumb to group pressure, because they understand who they are and they are not willing to sacrifice to be a part of a group, but rather to be the unique individual they are by using their mind in the only way they can, uniquely to them.
So it's interesting you bring up the point about using the mind and seeing the bigger picture. The way I like to understand that concept is think of the mind as a magnifying glass. What we do with the mind ordinarily is we pick something, an idea or a thought, and then we just drill right into it and then just blow it out of proportion. And using those 16 aspects, we create a whole different experience than what it otherwise is. But then if you don't have that magnifying glass, then you see a bigger picture. If you're walking in a street with a magnifying glass, chances are you're probably going to run into a lamppost, or you're probably going to run into people. But then if you have your eyes wide open, you can see everything and continue on. And this is where stepping back a little bit from the mind, from a sense of presence inside, and then approaching life as the big picture, as a whole, as opposed to through a tiny lens of a single thought.
You know, that brings us to a whole area that I think will be a subject of a next conversation or another conversation, and that is how to use our focus. What is our life purpose? Because when you really break it down and you're here, yeah, we can be the observer, we can be the infinite observing ourselves through life, but there's an aspect of us that came into this world to experience it. And each of us has unique gifts. I have unique gifts as a minister. Niranjan has unique gifts as a doctor. And we bring those gifts along with other gifts to the world. And our mind is the vessel through which we get to create. We're given a blank canvas when we start out this journey. And we've got all the colors of the rainbow, infinite amounts of paint ready for us. And our mind is the brush. And what we paint on it, we create. I like to think of it as a slide. When you have a projector and you shine light through the slide from the projector and it goes onto the wall, what we do with our mind is we create the slide. And whatever that slide is, the projector that is life energy shines into that slide, and that becomes our experience. So we don't have to worry about creating, we have to worry about creating our slide. And our mind gives us the ability to put anything we want on it. But we've got to buy into the fact that we're worthy to put it on there. And a lot of times that lack of worth limits what we put on our slide.
Well, that's our discussion today about the mind, its aspects, whether it can be defined at all, and how we can effectively use it. We touched a little bit about it, but in subsequent talks and discussions, we will certainly go deeper into the other aspects of our inner being and how we can create the paradise that we can carry everywhere we go. If you like this show, please subscribe and share it with your friends. And until next time, have a wonderful day.